When analyzing literature, we typically focus on plot, characters, or historical context. But texts also provide an externalized trace of how information is processed. We cannot read a novel and determine what percentage of an author's neurons were firing in the visual cortex. A text is not a literal brain scan. It does, however, show us how a mind organizes sensation, perception, and abstract thought to construct a meaningful reality on the page. By mapping these representational pathways, we can build a quantitative framework to measure the cognitive architectures of different literary works. This approach provides a method to analyze literary style through the specific informational pathways that define it. This equation is the starting point for our framework, the basic cognitive content ratio. The first variable, S, stands for sensory density. This measures the presence of immediate environmental information, colors, sounds, textures, and bodily states. P represents perceptual organization. This tracks how those sensory inputs are structured into recognizable scenes, objects, and spatial relationships. C is conceptual abstraction, covering the leap into generalized meaning, explicit reasoning, and symbolism. This simple ratio gives us a baseline, but applying it to actual empirical texts reveals structural limits almost immediately. To establish that baseline, we look at Naser Khosrow's 11th century travel diary, the Safarnama. This flowchart models Khosrow's cognitive architecture. An encounter produces sensory data, organized into a perceptual scene, which is then described. The conceptual variable functions as basic categorization. The traveler compares the new environment to previous knowledge, drawing conclusions from the observed landscape. External environments change rapidly, cities, roads, markets, while the observer remains a stable presence linking them together. The processing trajectory flows cleanly in one direction. Sensation feeds perception, which feeds concept. This makes the text an ideal baseline. It represents an architecture built entirely around the continuity of the observed world. A completely different architecture appears in the Wandering Doctor narrative, centered on the Persian polymath Avicenna. Here, geographical locations like Bukhara and Isfahan are merely staging grounds. The physical travel exists to frame an internal confrontation with knowledge, suffering, and mortality. This expanded diagram introduces R for explicit reasoning. The progression moves from an organized perception to a conceptual problem, which triggers systematic reasoning, ultimately generating a new, transformed concept. This introduces a stress test for the linear model. Farid al-Din Attar's mystical epic, The Conference of the Birds, breaks the sequence entirely. This reversed vector diagram shows why a strict left-to-right reading misinterprets Attar's landscape. The physical volleys his birds travel through are generated by a prior concept. The concept creates a symbol, which then constructs an imagined perceptual space. In mystical literature, the abstract idea precedes and organizes the physical world represented. This requires a new variable, transformational depth. It tracks how a narrative systematically reorganizes the identity of the traveler as they move toward an organizational destination. Adding transformational depth allows us to mathematically map texts where the apparent physical geography is actually a topography of consciousness. The ultimate stress test for any linear reading comes from Sadegh Hedayat's surrealist novel, The Blind Owl. Hedayat's text is saturated with intense, vivid sensory imagery, shadows, smells, physical textures. Yet this massive volume of intense sensory input data completely fails to construct any stable, objective external world. This recursive network diagram illustrates the looping mechanism. Sensory input triggers involuntary memory. Memory activates emotion, generating a new image that alters initial perception. We track this by adding parameters for associative cognition, emotional weighting, and a modifier for perceptual stability, which fear is exceptionally low. The network is highly active, constantly generating detailed perceptual representations, but those representations are deeply unstable, dissolving and bleeding into one another. This dismantles a common assumption in literary analysis. High sensory density indicates a large volume of input data. It does not guarantee objective realism in the resulting narrative. This expanded equation brings these stress tests together into a single multidimensional cognitive content ratio. The variables inside the brackets measure specific cognitive content volume. Modifiers outside determine processing direction and narrative orientation. This formula calculates transition probabilities, tracking how one state turns into another. For Naser Khosrow, the probability of sensation moving to stable perception is extremely high. For Hedayat, the probability of perception decaying into associative mind-wandering dominates the text. Transition probabilities identify the specific structural mechanics that move a reader from one cognitive state to the next. Viewing these works on a multidimensional map shows that literary cognition occupies a field of varying pathways, not a single line from sensation to abstraction. Naser Khosrow anchors the quadrant for highly stable, externally generated perception. Writers like Attar and Basho operate in the transitional center, constantly compressing objective observation into internal theoretical or contemplative meaning. Attar scores exceptionally high on the vertical axis of transformational depth, while Hedayat is pushed deep into the zone of internal recursive instability. These are not competing stages of development. They are alternative, highly functional architectures used to construct a continuous experience for a reader. Naser Khosrow continuously observes a changing world. Attar builds an allegorical road to dismantle the traveler's identity. Hedayat traps the reader in the recursive loop of subjective memory. By mapping these structures, we move past debating what a story is about. We gain an empirical toolkit to study how humans organize information, turning literature into a laboratory for the mechanics of the mind.